Welcome everyone to the Davis Humanities Institute online conversation series. This is our second event this month on policing and abolition. This one is the Minneapolis Uprising, Abolition and the Struggle for a Police-Free City. For those of you who missed our last one, 400 Years of Resistance, Race, Policing and Abolition, you can watch it on our YouTube page. And for your friends who have to miss this one, they can watch this event on our YouTube page as well, which you can find on the DHI website, www.dhi.ucdavis.edu. I'm very, very pleased to welcome this group of activists and organizers from Minneapolis working on the ground to build mutual aid networks, community defense units, to house the homeless, and in many other ways to create a viable, more democratic, kinder, and police-free city. This panel is about abolition as a practice and about world building in the here and now. Without further ado, because there's so much to discuss, I will briefly introduce our panelists who will speak for about 50 minutes, followed by 25 minutes or so of Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A mechanism and not in chat. Okay, Rosemary Pfister is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, public health nurse, and harm reductionist working with drug users and people without housing. They have been working in the homeless service industry on occupied Dakota land in Minneapolis for over 15 years, and recently started a program to prioritize access to care for those hardest hit by the war on drugs and land dispossession. Adam Bledsoe is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society at the University of Minnesota. He was born and raised in the Twin Cities. His scholarly and political work concerns political struggles across the African diaspora. Sheila Najad is an organizer who, over the past 5 years, has helped lead campaigns to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. She currently organizes Reclaim the Block and MPD 150. Sheila is also Minister of the Interior at Ricardo Levins Morales Art Studio. Junauda Petrus Nassau is a writer, pleasure activist, abolitionist, filmmaker, and performance artist of Black Caribbean descent, born on Dakota land in Minneapolis. Her work centers around wildness, queerness, Black diasporic futurism, ancestral healing, sweetness, shimmer, and liberation. Her first YA novel, The Stars and the Blackness Between Them, received a Coretta Scott King Honor Award. And Charmaine Chua, who will be moderating the panel, is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her scholarly work and political work explores the politics of racial capitalism and supply chain distribution and their effects on terrains of internationalist struggle under US empire. She lived and worked in Minneapolis for 8 years and is a member of the Abolition Journal Collective. Welcome everyone, and I will now turn the floor over to Charmaine.
Thank you, Kathy, so much for organizing this panel, and to the staff at the UC Davis Humanities Institute for providing a platform for these crucial contributions. I'm really honored to moderate this discussion and excited to hear from our incredible panelists today. I want to just start by reading a statement from graduate student workers involved in the cost of living adjustment, COLA movement across UC campuses, as I think it connects really crucially the struggles for a living wage at the UCs to the national movement against police violence. Strikers and protesters involved in the Wildcat strike for a cost of living adjustment, COLA, at UC Santa Cruz and other campuses this academic year have experienced extraordinary repression for demanding a living wage. More than 80 graduate students were fired and 41 graduate students remain ineligible for work in the fall. In February, UCSC administration spent $300,000 per day, totaling roughly $6 million to activate police mutual aid networks. The UC Santa Cruz Police Department was reinforced by other UCPDs, city, country, state, and National Guard. They used military surveillance equipment to monitor the activities of students and deployed police in full riot gear who beat undergraduate and graduate students with batons. Some still suffer from their injuries. In the months since the February picket line, the same UCPD officers who brutalized students have been deployed alongside city and county police forces to brutalize protesters in the streets of Oakland, reciprocating the police mutual aid from which they benefited only a few weeks ago. The national debate about defunding and redesigning police then is necessarily the UC's too. Most recently, statements from these police officers have been the evidentiary foundation of discipline through the campus student code of conduct. This discipline takes the form of student suspensions for up to 2 years, overwhelmingly targeting undocumented students and students of color. UCPD, as the backbone of disciplinary proceedings meant to maintain order among students and workers, is a structuring element of the university as a whole. We decry the violence of UCPD and all police on our campuses and in the streets of our cities. The University of California must defund, disarm, and dismantle all UC police departments. It must also end all military spending, development of war resources, and imperializing investments and practices. ICE agents must be prohibited from entering and detaining students on our so-called sanctuary campuses. Finally, all fired graduate students must be reinstated, and there must be no further retaliation against all involved in the strike. So again, this is a statement from UC students involved in the COLA movement. And should you be interested in signing their petition demanding reinstatement for the fired UC Santa Cruz workers, Kathy is going to drop a link in the chat.
I actually forgot to prepare the link. Do you have it?
That's okay. I'll find it. Yeah, I can do that. So a brief note on the format of today's panel. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to start with 2 questions that I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to in a rapid fire round of about 2 minutes each. And then I'm going to try to focus some questions on the specific kinds of organizing projects that each of the panelists have been involved in. So let's go now to Minneapolis, where in the 2 months since the police murder of George Floyd, collective outrage over the systematic racist police brutality has turned the city of Minneapolis into ground zero for the abolitionist struggle, sparking protests in over 2,000 US cities and towns in all 50 states, and from Palestine to Paris and Hong Kong in over 60 countries around the world. And for those of us who have lived and worked in Minneapolis, it's kind of strange to have our small city suddenly become this massive international flashpoint. Many cities are continuing to wage these struggles in direct confrontation with the brutality of the police in the streets. And while Minneapolis continues to do so as well, it has also turned towards what my friend and colleague Rob Nichols has identified as a second wave, building an alternative structure for a future without state oppression. Thousands in the city across a multiracial coalition of Minneapolis organizers and residents, and here I will share some pictures of what's been going on. Thousands in the city across a multiracial coalition of Minneapolis organizers and residents have set up community defense units and citizen fire squads, built mutual aid networks and outdoor kitchens to provide food and shelter to those shut out of social programming, occupied a whole hotel and moved in over 200 unhoused residents, built spaces for Black liberation and struggle through artistic practice and experimentation, including a community garden at the center of George Floyd Square, and convinced the city council to pledge the defunding and abolition of the Minneapolis Police Department. These efforts to build an alternative infrastructure while continuing to wage mass struggle in the streets are part of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the effort to build abolition through presence, not absence. That is to say, while the abolitionist struggle confronts the state with a legitimation crisis that is the outcome of decades, if not centuries, of the organized abandonment and organized violence of the anti-state state, that's Ruth Gilmore's language again, abolitionist struggle is also about the effort to build life-affirming institutions that are key to undermining the hold that the carceral state has on our lives. And so I just want to begin with a simple question with a brief sketch of this landscape. So my first question to all the panelists is a simple one. Could you please start with a brief description of the work you've been involved in on the ground in Minneapolis? Tell us a little bit about that work that you've been doing and how you see that work sitting in the broader fabric of anti-racist movements in Minneapolis and the even broader fabric of abolitionist struggle around the world. And maybe we could start with Rosemary. Sorry, maybe let's start with Adam, and then I'll call you as we go along.
Okay, well, thank you, Charmaine. Thanks for the introduction. So, you know, what I've been involved in, I think like a lot of people here, has been, you know, I've been doing things like working at food drops and things of that nature, doing translation work at food drops. But the thing that I feel like I've contributed most, since this has all started, is kind of helping with the communication side of things, as far as getting the stories of what's going on out to people who are either not here in the Twin Cities or might not have the ability to be entirely mobile while all of this is going on. So, I helped do some translation work for conversations between activists in Minneapolis with anti-police violence activists in Brazil, people who are working on similar issues in other countries, and haven't been getting the full story of, what's going on because they live somewhere else and because the media in Brazil is not friendly currently to leftist and progressive politics. The thing that I think I've been focusing most of my attention on right now is working on building an archive of testimonials and oral histories of what's going on currently. And so, just kind of put a plug in there. If you're seeing this and you're in Minneapolis, and you're active, or you just want to share your story, I'm happy to talk to you about it. But what the project is really trying to do is give people in the Twin Cities and especially people of color, right, and especially Black and Indigenous people, an opportunity to kind of talk about what they're seeing, what they're thinking about, what they're feeling, and what they're hoping for moving forward. And so, how I see that as being tied to the wider struggle, right, of abolition is just simply giving people an opportunity to control a narrative about what's going on in their own city and going on in their own lives, right? I have not been impressed. I actually been kind of disturbed by what I've been seeing in the mainstream media, both local and national, with regards to what it's reflecting about what's happening in the Twin Cities right now. And so, creating a public archive where people can share stories and connect with one another, I think is important, and something that I hope is actually useful moving forward as we try to create the Twin Cities in the world that we want to see.
Thank you, Adam. Let's go to Janata.
Hi, I'm Janata. I use she, her pronouns. Essentially, I find my work to be as a creative, and I feel like my work has always been centered in abolition and questioning and interrogating police state and violence. When the uprising initially happened, I attended to it like a lot of people who are in the community, where it happened is 4 blocks from where I live. It very much was like a visceral sort of like just response of, we've all been shut up in our house. And then we see this thing that's very much, where it happened is very much central in our community. So for me, a lot of the work kind of got pushed into a poem that I wrote a couple of years ago around giving the police department to the grandmothers, which was something that I had written when Michael Brown's murderer was essentially acquitted. And it's interesting, I bring that up because it's sort of like shaped a lot of how my organizing and activism is looking right now within this particular movement. I think so much of my activism for a lot of my life has been centered around protesting, has been centered around kind of direct action. And what I felt was important to kind of center in with this moment is around aspects of healing. And thinking about past moments like when Philando Castile was murdered, as well as Jamar Clark, just acknowledging just how much people's mental health was triggered into destabilization, and also a lot of collective trauma. And I also know that there's a lot of ways that people needed the imagination to really think around, imagination to really think about what is possible besides a police state. And I think similarly to what y'all have been speaking to in this call is that we may have talked about stopping police brutality, but this shift into abolition and really giving people permission to investigate and inquire it. So a lot of my work has been in, working in networks of healers, working in networks of artists and creatives, to develop media and different kind of artistic expressions to embody what abolition is. Because right now it's cerebral and kind of hard to understand, but how do we embody depolicing ourselves from living in a police state? I think another thing that I've done work on is I did an all black bike ride to sort of take up space in socially distant ways, but really just give a lot of opportunities to have people, like I said, embody abolition when so much of it might seem hard to understand. But what is it like to be in our communities as Black people and not police ourselves, assume we're getting policed, or be in fact policed by whether it's the police folks or just white folks who are policing our bodies. So I think that's, been work that I've been doing forever, but it's really been amplified in this moment in a certain way.
Thanks, Janata. Sheila?
Hi, y'all. My name is Sheila. I use she and her pronouns. And I am an organizer with MPD 150, which did a people's evaluation of the Minneapolis Police Department on its 150th anniversary, and also a member of Reclaim the Block, which works to defund the Minneapolis Police Department and invest in things that really keep us safe. And yeah, on the ground, wow, it's been a wild couple months. And so we've been doing with Reclaim the Block some policy organizing with the city council. I'm also a street medic, so I was out there in the streets a few nights as well, and really trying to think through how we harness the energy of this moment and turn it into lasting solutions that can't be co-opted. And I think we're really lucky in Minneapolis because we've done a lot of work over the last few years to kind of inoculate against that co-option. And I'm sure we will get a chance to talk about that later. So I'll just stop now.
And Rosemary.
Hey everyone. So I have been part of some longstanding work in the community, including through my professional work, providing direct aid to communities who are impacted by the drug war and land dispossession, housing dispossession, homelessness. And in the lead up, COVID was the focus of the crisis. A lot of people everywhere were forming mutual aid projects, building on some of the longer, deeper harm reduction movement work that's happened here and elsewhere. And a group of housing justice activists had been thinking, like people all around the country, about the vacant hotels as a form of public infrastructure and an obvious answer for emergency housing, as we're seeing a massive increase in homelessness, and particularly unsheltered homelessness here. That's now just accelerating even more. And like organizers around the country, we were thinking about ways that we could commandeer hotels. And then the uprising began, and George Floyd, who I always like to point out worked at a shelter in town, his death made it possible. And the groundwork that others had laid, like having the work of MPD 150 and having the work of so many other folks, made it possible for this to happen in Minneapolis. So we harnessed that energy and had to make a decision in a very rapid, within a couple of hours, about whether or not we were going to go ahead and take a hotel that we had had our eyes on, and decided to go for it and take the risk. And we ended up getting the whole hotel for about 2 weeks. And like Charmaine had mentioned in the introduction, housing more than 200 people. In the end, it was about 700 people who came through that space, about 300 who stayed there, and an additional 400 who signed up for a waiting list to be able to try to get in. So the scale of the problem is much more than what one hotel could possibly solve. And the enormity of work involved in one hotel was also a really big learning experience, and speaks to kind of the importance of thinking about abolition as work that you put into practice every day. It's something that takes a lot of work, and as something that's like a process of disentangling social services and healthcare and other things that have been deputized, and having them having direct aid become direct action, and working towards the future that we want to build together.
Thank you, Rosemary. It's such a beautiful tapestry of what's been going on in Minneapolis. I want to maybe just turn to a second kind of rapid fire question explicitly around this term abolition that we've been using in our vocabulary. And part of what I've been thinking about is the way in which the abolitionist horizon, which sometimes felt further away to me, you know, that one day we might get the police departments out of cities, but for now we're going to build these life-affirming institutions, has suddenly been brought much closer forward, right? All of a sudden, the Minneapolis City Council is announcing that they are pledging to abolish the police. And so there seems to be this sudden kind of way in which both the term abolition and what we mean by it could potentially be in the process of co-optation by different kinds of state forces. But at the same time, there is so much kind of genuine abolitionist building that's happening in the city of Minneapolis. And so I was wondering if you could all speak to this, just a simple question: what does the term abolition mean to you? And in what ways do you see abolition theory and practice relating to each other in your experience of the past couple of months and in your organizing in the time before? Maybe I'll just open it, and whoever wants to jump in first should feel free.
You said it was a simple question. One thing I think about with this is why are we using the term abolition rather than something else? Especially when we're doing this real work right now with like actual policy implications around defunding and dismantling the police, and having a movement around a concept and a belief, like with something like abolition, is just really, really important. Like Janata said, having the ability to imagine a different possibility takes a lot of work. Trying to imagine a different way of doing things and then trying to put that into practice is really challenging. We've all been sort of trained in this way to think about things that makes that very hard. And that's something that I've certainly seen enacted within the housing work. So why abolition? And I think part of that is, as people have referenced, trying to avoid co-optation, trying to distinguish this from a reform movement, and just as a way to defend a dream and be able to create the space to build that. And obviously it calls in specifically issues of anti-Black racism, and specifically roots around stolen labor. And that's really important to be able to have a historical lineage.
Thank you, Rosemary. Who wants to go next? Janata, please.
Yeah, no, I appreciated what you had to say around, like, you know, connecting it to legacies of abolition and thinking around anti-Blackness specifically as a function of our police state and a lot of systems of repression. Y'all, I'm sorry, I don't know what they're doing outside my house, but of course they doing it. And this is like my one space to kind of not be dealing with my child anyway, who I love, but you know, not on this call. Hopefully I'm still heard okay though. Yeah, okay, so, but yeah, so like for me, it's like as a person that's been against the police state since I've been, you know, in my teens in the 90s, when it was all about stop the police, you know, stop police brutality. And it very was like kind of ambiguous now looking back. And I think like abolition and defunding the police is actually a thing that is a function of something we can do. And I think it does interrogate the system inherently, like, you know, why is this the system of how a lot of society functions with harm and functions with loss? And I think it does have us interrogate white supremacy in a way that I think just looking at police brutality doesn't quite as much. And I think for me, so I've been doing work, like my work up until this time has been, like I said, as an artist and working with an experimental art collective, Free Black Dirt, which now looking back, our work has always been abolitionist. It's always talked about the police state. It's always talked about the prison industrial complex, and it includes it in conversations around art and Blackness as like you know, like all tied up and entangled, as they say. But I think I've also, we've been like expanding into this work with the Black Abolitionist Network of Minnesota, which has been like all of these Black activists and organizers and thinkers that in a lot of ways our work has either been adjacent or deeply intersected with abolition, not just in this context, but in this idea of like freedom for Black people has never actually been offered and given and established. You know, like we live on a system that's like, you know, deeply invested and Black destruction and, you know, Black's labor and, you know, Black joy. So I think right now, like this idea of abolition, I've been really thinking about like, and I was talking to Charmaine about this, about embodying abolition, the erotics of abolition. Like, how do we truly understand that it's not just a cerebral thing, but that everything in our body has been shaped to, you know, accept and be in alignment with this system. So I think for me, like it's been just acknowledging that, you know, there's so much work to be done, and it really is going to be on a level that, you know, is going to have to address all the ways that we've been policed and have absorbed the police state in every aspect of our existence. So, yeah, that's what I got to say.
That's beautiful.
I'll go ahead, I guess, and is not going to be easy to follow up on what was just said, but I, you know, I feel that really encapsulates what Janana just said. Really encapsulates a lot of what abolition work is about, right? Because it's about the dismantling of certain oppressive institutions and structures. But if you don't, I think if you're not articulating what you want at the same time, it's a lot harder to do away with those oppressive structures and institutions, right? And I think one, abolition is an unrealized project, as yet unrealized project, something that has been in the making for centuries, you know, something that has been perhaps most clearly articulated, right, and expressed by the people who have been most oppressed in society, right? And in this case, I'm talking about Black people and Indigenous people as well. And I think it's something that there are glimmers of hope, right? There appear to be seeds for that new being, that new existence, whatever it is, whatever you want to call it, that are in place currently, and that are, you know, I hope are ultimately cultivated and allowed to become predominant in society. Thinking about abolishing, right, and kind of like Janata was saying, not just addressing police brutality, but doing away with state forces that are coercive in and of themselves, right? Creating situations that I already see kind of seeds in the mutual aid autonomous zones, right? People being able to go to spaces and get what they need without having to worry about whether or not they have enough money for it, right? Whether or not they're going to be harassed, have the cops called on them, right? When they're getting their necessities. And so, yeah, you know, I guess I'll end it there, but just say that, you know, I think it's a really important thing to both dismantle and build at the same time. I think without that, it's not really possible to abolish the systemic oppression that we face.
Yeah, I think so many people have said already what I would say. Part of me, why abolition is about closing the door on the possibility of reform, which I think is so important in what we've done here in Minneapolis, is like, we've tried all the flavors of reform, right? And none of them have worked. And so we're ready to move on to abolition. And for me personally, I'm gonna drop a link for everybody. This is the article that when I read it, like actually helped me realize that abolition is possible. So this is by Rachel Herzing. And she talked about this image that I like couldn't get out of my head, that abolition is about like bulldozing, clearing the path to build new things. It's not about like picking and replacing and picking and replacing. Like, we need to clear the path because we're not going to have all the answers, but we need to get stuff out of the way. So as we build and grow as a community, we can grow those new answers. Yeah, so I encourage folks to read that if you want.
I love that, bulldozing the path away from reform. I want to turn to a question, I think, roughly about the state, and in particular around the, again, what Ruth Gilmore has called the organized abandonment and organized violence of the state. So one thing that, you know, all of you have been involved in mutual aid programs in Minneapolis. And one of the things that occurred to me in the morning after the Minneapolis Police Department started clearing the Sanctuary Hotel, and I was at the Powderhorn Park encampment where a lot of the residents who had been in the hotel had moved to the park, and the Minneapolis Police Department evicted the hotel, put those residents on buses, and told them to go to Powderhorn Park, saying there are resources there. Now, this is a state-run police department, right, where there are supposed to be state social programs for the unhoused. And yet, I think the sort of immense and magical mutual aid project ended up being a way for the state to abdicate its responsibility to its people and to push off that responsibility towards people who are doing mutual aid projects. And so I've been thinking about this kind of difficult relationship we have towards both needing to build the kinds of life-affirming institutions that all of you have been so beautifully working on, and yet finding a way to push a confrontation with the state in ways that demand more from it, rather than push off its responsibility. And I wonder if some of you can speak to that. I was thinking that Sheila in particular might speak to this, and if you could also just give us a glimpse into the process of working with state entities, right? How, or what are the major victories that you've seen? How did you actually get the city council to say that they're going to pledge to dismantle the police? And have there, since its promise, been complicated relationships with the state?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So, you know, I think getting the city council to say that they are going to begin the process of ending the Minneapolis Police Department, which was the statement we wrote for them and they pledged to. Burning down the precinct had a lot to do with that. Really, we got there because of the Black youth and youth of color in Minneapolis who were absolutely fearless in the streets, day after day after day. That's why we got there, period. The policy stuff, though, if you want to get into that, those specific council members, we got to travel back in time to 2017. So 2017, all of these council members were running for office that year. And that also happened to be the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department. So that's when MPD 150 had started doing our People's History review of the Minneapolis Police Department. And what that really did was write a history that had never been written before. We went deep into the records, found every attempted reform, and also the history of community resilience that had been lost in the mainstream media, like Adam was talking about. So the AIM Patrol in Minneapolis, which is still around in an iteration, the Soul Patrol, ways that people have really taken care of each other. And our narrative work around that, so right, that work was about closing the door on reform for people, and also outlining a path forward that we can actually transition away from policing now. And we like highlighted different ways that we can do that through transferring services, through just cutting out unnecessary places where police are. And that narrative work was so powerful that it in fact influenced the city council race. So a group in town did a poll of city council members and said, can you imagine a world without police? And many of them said yes. And it created such a hullabaloo that the police department held this big press conference being like, no, 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 don't look at that. Look at what we're doing. Nothing's happening over there. So it started out from the get-go there. And MPD 150, our report, we used it to educate folks in classrooms, in churches, in living rooms, really helping people imagine abolition. And that morphed into another group, Reclaim the Block, which partnered with Black Visions as our anchor organization. And we ran a successful defund campaign in 2018 that took $1.1 million out of the police department and put it into create the new Office of Violence Prevention. So this was all building up like this incremental understanding of like, no, we don't want police, reform won't work. Okay, here's a path forward of like, we should be moving money out of the police and into violence prevention. And actually our campaign was about moving more money into housing and making that abolitionist connection. All the people turned out and testified for that. The council members weren't quite ready to put money into it. So that all brought us up to this moment. So we have already primed these council members. Some of them ran being accountable to imagining a police-free future. And when the time came and they were talking with community members and saying, hey, what are we gonna do? We said, we're gonna abolish the police. And that's how we got there. And now we are in the nitty gritty, right, of how do we make it happen, changing the budget, changing our city charter. Yeah, and I'm gonna stop there. I think that's where I should stop.
Thank you for that incredible work. Rosemary, do you want to speak a little bit to how the mutual aid projects, especially with unhoused folks, has had this kind of complicated relationship to the state?
I can try to. I think about this stuff all the time, and it just feels so huge, and I'm not really sure where to start or where we'll end. So I just want to name too that I'm coming to work around housing through my labor as somebody that works in the homeless service industry. And a lot of folks that I've been organizing with, that's also true for them. And so trying to think about things outside of that type of a model can be kind of hard for us sometimes. There's also just so many different, it's like a very tactical way to try to distract people from actually getting things done by getting into meetings all the time. And just having so many like very intricate and very detailed ways that we're supposed to be making change. And then on another end of things, I just want to be realistic that we're looking at 28 million evictions by October. That's a scale that mutual aid projects that me and you organize in our neighborhood park will not be able to address. That's a deeper structural issue. So the mutual aid projects are getting at that and helping with imagination and helping with direct aid and creating the leverage points and the wedges so that we can start kind of finding the spaces to open up, like the back door to leave open, and imagining new models, making new models. We also need some much deeper and much larger structural reforms if we're going to be able to address something that's looming like that, and to realize and acknowledge that, you know, when we're talking about things like housing, we're talking about land, and ultimately what I think a lot of us are talking about is land redistribution. Like that's what we need. Land redistribution, land repatriation. And so how we try to make that step-by-step happen is what we're experimenting with right now. There's so many different little pieces that can get important and get distracting, and trying to distinguish between, especially in Minneapolis, and like organized left culture and sort of nonprofitization, like trying to be able to be strategic about what path you go down. As easy, you can't do everything, so you have to be able to organize more people, and you have to be able to think long-term.
Thanks, Rosemary. I want to maybe see if Janata and Adam had anything more to add to this, and if not, I'll go to another question.
Yeah, I honestly don't remember the question now, but I liked everything y'all had to say.
That's okay. I have a question for you
Yeah.
in a little bit. So I'd like to ask a question to Adam. You've been starting a project now and published a Minneapolis Uprising syllabus that's gotten a lot of attention, and people have been using it as a resource. Thank you so much for that. From your own work and study, how would you situate this moment in Minneapolis historically in terms of the legacies of Black political organizing in Minneapolis across the decades, nationally and internationally? And if you could chart a path for sort of how we led up to this moment, that would be great, both in terms of the invisible work that was ongoing before and that will be ongoing after these flashpoints.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, I'll start out by saying that what we're seeing, right, as far as Black people pushing political change in Minneapolis and St. Paul is not anything new. And I think a lot of the times Black politics kind of gets obscured when people think about Minneapolis or think about the Twin Cities generally. They don't, I think a lot about the cities as being a site of Black political activity. But in reality, it's something that's been going on since like the 19th century. You know what I'm saying? It's been going on for quite some time. And I'm not going to right now talk about, the abolitionist tendencies of the really, really small Black minority of 1860s St. Anthony or anything like that. But, if you want to check out the syllabus, it's got all that in it. But if you look at the past 100 years, right, say like the 1920s to now, you have Black communities and Black political organizations that are organizing, and I think kind of embodying what I would say are four specific kind of characteristics. One being kind of the joint use of direct action in the public occupation of space. Along with grassroots organizing on the ground to try to affect change, right? So organizing at the grassroots level and then coupling that with, really in your face direct action, forcing people to take account and take note of the conditions that Black people are living in and what they do want to change about the Twin Cities. The second thing I would say is that while certain moments I think are defined as being about a certain thing, right? Like right now, talking about police abolition and police violence, right? State violence. There is always, undoubtedly, a plethora of oppressive factors that have pushed Black people to take matters into their own hands and try to affect the change, right? Some of those have to do with the state. Some of them have to do with, access to jobs. Sometimes it's about education, healthcare. It's about a lot of different things, but it's never one issue, right? And that is very much the case right now as well. This isn't just about the police murdering George Floyd. It's about a lot of other things that are going on, which I think are really well embodied by everybody else that's on this panel right now. The third thing that I would say, and I think that this can't be overstated enough, is the centrality of Black women to political organizing in the Twin Cities. Now, that's something that I think is getting its a fair explanation right now. Or not, I'm sorry, not a fair explanation, but some acknowledgement, a necessary acknowledgement right now. But if you look back at the labor movement of the early 20th century, and even the civil rights / Black power movement of the mid and late 20th century, Black women were really sort of written out of that history a lot of the time. There are people like Nellie Stone Johnson and Josie Johnson who were seen, who are rightfully seen as being very proactive in the civil rights movement and labor movement, but Black women generally as a collective have not been, I think, given their due in recognizing their contributions to politics in the Twin Cities. And then finally, I would say that the fourth characteristic is the reality of Black political organizations being able, at least temporarily, to forge alliances with non-Black organizations and communities as well. So if we look at, say, the labor movement in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, right, there were, there was a recognition among the Black community that access to jobs, low wages, residential segregation, hostile work environments were all areas that were negatively affecting them. And through, kind of joint coordination with all white labor unions like the American Federation of Labor, the Teamsters Union, which was very powerful in Minneapolis at the time, as well as the really intense and under-acknowledged role of Black women in helping these labor organizations organize. There was an ability for people at the time to secure higher wages, right, secure better working conditions, and actually push legislation like making Minneapolis the first place that guaranteed civil rights in the workspace, right, guaranteed equal rights in the workplace, which is probably part of the reason why Minneapolis has this reputation for being a progressive place, right? But a lot of that, what passes as progressive, was something that was pushed by Black Minneapolitans and St. Paulites. So if we go through then the civil rights and Black power movement, you have the similar thing, a recognition of really, really substandard living conditions, crowded housing, forced displacement through a lot of infrastructural projects, disproportionate poverty and incarceration and things like that. And it's really only through uprisings, once again, the uprisings of the 1960s, that you start to see some progressive steps being taken by the city government of Minneapolis and St. Paul, right? You see grassroots organizing taking place and organizations like the Way Incorporated and the City Incorporated that sort of, I guess, were in a lot of ways kind of the forerunners of mutual aid networks that we talk about. Sheila had mentioned before Soul Patrol, right? That in a lot of ways, I think, has a lot of sort of similarities to what is being called for right now, right? Nonviolent, community-based conflict resolution, right? Where they were specifically saying, we don't want the police to be handling these issues in our community. We can handle them ourselves. The Way and the City both were organizations that had at the helm Black women, right? Who, again, didn't get a lot of credit for the work that they did. And so, I don't want to take up too much time. Now we could talk about going into the 20th century as you see shifts in things like increased policing, disinvestment in public education. You had grassroots organizations that were again stepping up to try to address those issues in the community. Whether it was the City Incorporated creating task forces in their organization that worked to broker coalitions between different gangs in North Minneapolis, so that it wouldn't be understood that the police had to handle those things, right? Or the African American Academy for Accelerated Learning in South Minneapolis that sought to step up and take on the role of educating Black youth to address the fact that children were being policed in school spaces, right? Were disproportionately in special ed programs and things of that nature. So again, those were programs largely conceived and run by Black women. And I don't think right now the organizations that we're seeing on the ground doing this work stray from that tendency very much, right? As was mentioned, abolishing the police came about because people took to the streets, right? And for months. When has that ever happened before, right? People, direct action, months-long direct action, pushing people to conceive of a different world. Grassroots organizations like the ones represented by the people on this panel, right, have been doing the work, right, but have especially, I think, stepped up right now to try to push change. Like I said, Black women are finally, I think, sort of becoming recognized as being leaders in these political organizations. Black Visions is an explicitly queer Black feminist organization. You think about like the Northside Emergency Resource Pop-Up, right, run by Black women as well. And all of that to say, I think the groundwork has also been set for non-Black people to act as allies and act in vital roles in this moment as well, which again is something that I think is a long-standing characteristic of Black movements in the Twin Cities. I think conceived of and guided by Black people, but also finding alliances and allyship with non-Black communities, Indigenous communities, white communities as well. So, you know, I guess that's a really long-winded way of saying what we're seeing today didn't come out of nowhere. It's very much part of a longer, I think, legacy genealogy of Black struggle in the cities.
Thank you, Adam. That was an incredible history in 10 minutes of Minneapolis. That's incredible. Janata, I want to ask you a question about your visions of Black liberation that are articulated through artistic experimentation and artistic practice. You know, the Black Panther Party's founding member and chief theoretician, Huey Newton, has written, right, in an essay called "We Must Survive Until We Can Transform Society." And he says this: "We must not regard our survival programs as an answer to the world problem of oppression. We don't even claim it to be a revolutionary program. Revolutions are made of sterner stuff. We do say that if the people are not here, revolution cannot be achieved. And for the people and only the people make revolutions." And so I want to pose a question to you about the ways in which, as the rebellion is ongoing, one of the things that I saw in Minneapolis was an immense occurrence of strained relationships, of breaking friendships that sort of come out of some of the challenges of organizing when you're in crisis moments, but also I think a lack of thinking around the necessity of practices of interpersonal relationship building and self-care in the movement itself. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to this dynamic that Huey Newton has talked about, that in order for revolution to happen, we have to survive and we have to thrive. Could you say a little bit about, you know, how you think about artistic practice or self-care building those kinds of worlds?
Yeah, no, I love that I love just thinking about it because I think so much of my earlier activism was around feeling like we had to struggle, and that actually was a central part of how we understood how we existed in movements. And I'm grateful to be alive at a time when there is such a clear idea that we are a microcosm of a macrocosm we're trying to make. I think in speaking around strained relationships and like the dynamics that have blossomed, because here you have, you know, a city that like one day was just, you know, regularly, you know, typically racist ass, crazy, you know, whatever city, you know, but then all of a sudden this moment happened and there was just like all of these resources, you know, dropped into the city, you know, there's all of, and, you know, so, and I speak to that because I do think that like was a big part of the tension is like, who gets, you know, to represent, you know, what's happening right now, who are the leaders and all of these things, you know, and I think, you know, for me, it also like really was like, you know, based on the fact that like so much of the past organizing work that's happened really destroyed people's spirits. You know, it's not hard. I mean, it's not easy night after night, day after day, like struggling against a system that wants, you know, you oppressed and dead, you know, and it's something that you've had to live and exist in for so long. And I think like any situation, like things come out sideways. And I think a lot of people's mental health, a lot of people's, you know, sort of, you know, traumas were really, you know, pulled out of these spaces. And we don't have infrastructure or even experiences on how to really hold each other or even hold ourselves, you know? So I think for me, so much of like, I guess maybe just, you know, I'm a very like nurturing and loving and, you know, really am a person that's like, all right, like how so much of the work in the past things was me just creating spaces, like having people come to my house, making people food, like, you know, really thinking that like, you know, we need to like offer people tenderness and softness and all of these things to really do the work rather than it always being seen as this, you know, thing you do head on and with this intensity. So I think like, and this kind of goes along with the idea of abolition, right? Like a lot of it is abolishing these ideas of oppression, even in trying to destabilize oppression, right? Like how do we get to be tender to ourselves? Like I really, in this particular season of uprising, because you know, like all of y'all have spoken to, this is, you know, this cycle looks different because of all of these factors, but this is things that happen all the time if you're a part of movements. It's like these constant traumas, things, you know, seem kind of good, then things got kind of weird, and then people split off and people was dating and that kind of impacted shit too. You know what I mean? Like this is real. You know, it's not how like when you're kids and you're thinking of Malcolm X and all these people, they seem kind of sterilized of their humanity. And I think like we're deeply in our humanity in Minneapolis right now. Like I think about the sanctuary, I think about what's happening at the site of George Floyd's murder. It's like, it's just so viscerally in our humanity, in a way that I think I want to lean into with a sense of like sweetness and healing. And I'm very afraid, and I'm very like depressed and anxious a lot. Like I had to name that to myself today, and that's like a natural state of what's happening in our city. Like for weeks, you know, we've had police, we've had, you know, kind of these deputized white supremacists like lurking. We've had, you know, a community that has been deeply gentrified and has policed, you know, certain bodies, Black bodies, Indigenous bodies, because of this gentrification. So I think for me, like, you know, in thinking of this moment, I'm just like, gosh, like, I just want us to really find all of this compassion for each other and, you know, ourselves, and see that as like a central part of the work. And I think, and I always come back to this idea of sweetness and like whimsy. Like so much of my work as an artist is very much about allowing people to disappear in beauty while dealing with hard truths. You know, like my first sort of like, you know, I don't know, just kind of thing I lean into is like, yeah, like how could I bring like a sense of softness and calm into situations? Because I think that's like easily the first thing that leaves when we're in a space of fear. Yeah, so I really do feel like right now we need a lot of creativity, we need a lot of imagination, we need a lot of, you know, things that oppression has told us we don't get to have. If you're poor, you don't get to like dream, you know, limitlessly. If you're Black, you don't get to feel like you can just embody space without people wondering if you're up to something. Yeah, and you know, so I think that's the answer.
So much. And it reminds me that abolition is internal and external, right? Part of the project of abolition is to also abolish punitive forms of punitive mentalities within the ways that we reproduce those in our interpersonal relationships.
Oh, yeah.
We have a couple minutes more, and I have a last question for all of you. But Rosemary, I want to maybe just briefly ask you this question as well. You work in a space of harm reduction a lot, and you think a lot about this relationship between abolition and harm reduction, particularly in working in abolitionist spaces with people who bear a lot of trauma. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit as well about this relationship we're talking about abolition as a sort of internal and external condition.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I just keep feeling harm reduction and abolition as such intertwined, like twins. The place that I go to when I get confused or get feeling lost or get feeling like everything is too big and hard to understand, or when relationships are strained, is always falling back on harm reduction as a movement, and letting and just realizing. So for those, just to define that for a moment, harm reduction is a movement of drug users doing illegal things to take care of each other. We can have a reductionist definition of that and say harm reduction is clean syringes, safer injection supplies, condoms, bike helmets, and seatbelts. But that doesn't get at the spirit of the movement. Oftentimes what we see, and with great benefit, is harm reduction as a public health intervention. That's my job work, you know? And it's really important to have that be accessible and have that be distributed widely, and not rely on volunteers. But I really want to hold on to harm reduction as a movement of people who have messy lives, you know, and like letting it be messy, and not expecting people to show up and be, you know, having all the right language or having all the, like, you know, perfect sort of politics, or having things that they identify as politics even, you know, but like having space where things just are messy and being reality based about that, and working through it, which is hard. And, you know, it's not always going to be like a linear path. So yeah, I think embracing some of the mess and the complexity is something that, and the reality, just staying reality based about it, right? Like, and we're not talking, you know, some of the things that I think about with this as well is we say harm reduction, not risk reduction, right? Because we're thinking about the impact of things. And I don't want to necessarily reduce the risks that I'm taking. I want to challenge myself to be able to take smarter ones and more effective ones. The fear that we're like talking about, and I think all of us are feeling sort of viscerally, and just sort of like the discomfort that comes with this sort of like extended version of uprising is something that we have to be able to tolerate. We have to be able to tolerate things that are unpleasant and uncomfortable. That's what I say when I'm trying to be a therapist, at least, you know. And the fear is necessary, you know, like it's usually used and deployed as like a weapon of the state, and specifically as a weapon of the police. It's not just the, you know, kinetic impact devices, it's the entire, like, you know, aesthetic. Fear is the weapon. And when we can disarm that, and when we can embrace that you can't be brave unless you can have some fear, and unless you can start thinking about the risks that you want to take and be willing to take, then we're not gonna take the next step, you know. And I think we're all just on that precipice together right now, and that's exciting.
I love that. Thank you so much, Rosemary. So a quick question to all of you in 2 sentences or less. This is the last question for all the panelists. How do we actually dismantle and abolish the police? And what are the biggest challenges you see for the movement going forward? Easy question, no worries. Who wants to start?
Sheila, did you bring in the flow chart? Like, just step by step.
I can start. I think, how do we actually abolish the police? I think we do it by staying hopeful and focusing on what we want to build, not just what we want to take down. And I know, Charmaine, you asked a couple times about like this phenomenon of co-option, right? So we're gonna see the state try to take over. And our mayor here is like 2 steps behind. He just started saying police free, or beyond policing. But I think keeping an eye on those narratives and maybe making fun of them. So MPD 150, we did a comic called Community Policing and Other Fairy Tales. So I think it's gonna be hard. We're all tired. I know everyone on this call from Minneapolis, and I'm sure all of you all around the world are tired right now, but holding that joy and that beauty and all of this that we get to build right now is how we get there.
Adam?
Yeah, I guess I would say co-optation has been discussed, right? So I think that's one thing, but I think it's not just the state that's going to try to co-opt, it's also private industry that's going to try to co-opt. When we think about Minneapolis being doesn't it have like the highest number of Fortune 500 companies per capita in the country or something like that? You know, this is, I think, going to be an opportunity to look like you're woke, right? If you're some kind of industry, corporation, whatever. And I think if you look at the histories of organizing in the Twin Cities, but also just nationally, there's strong precedent for private corporations to also act in sort of a co-opting way. And the other thing I would say, aside from co-optation, is fatigue, right? And remembering, and I think this is a lot of what Janata's talking about too, is having to care for ourselves and care for one another, right? Because this issue is not going to be solved in a year. It's, you know, we'll know the outcome of this in maybe 20 years. You know, and maybe sooner than that, maybe, but the outcome of this is going to be long-term. It's not going to be short-term. So I'd say, yeah, fatigue and co-optation.
Lovely. Janata?
Yeah, I think, you know, what I really think, I just keep on thinking about embodying it, you know. I think that I really think of when I walk in spaces, like, how do I not walk in ways where I'm policing myself because I'm afraid of being policed? You know, a lot of it, I think, is, you know, there will be so much policy work we're doing. There's going to, you know, those are all like the logistic things, you know, that I kind of are inconceivable and develop day by day about what those things exactly are. But I really do think creating spaces for Black people to be like, we refuse to be policed, like in our bodies, no matter what y'all doing, no matter how y'all patrolling, you know, like, you know, we are not allowing the spirit and psyche of policing into our bodies anymore. You know, I think just even like this thing that is like, oh, the conversation you have with your children about how to protect yourself from police. It's like, you know, just like kind of the sickness of that, you know, like that we, you know, have to like do these things. And yes, it's out of safety and protecting, but, you know, like, what does it look like to live in a world where that's just not even a thing that we act is okay to have to tell a certain group of children? And I think, you know, to a lot of people's points around the police have been a part deeply in like social work and like, you know, helping people who are unsheltered and, you know, mental health stuff. I think for me is truly like living into this imagination of like, how do we hold and be caring and grounded in each other's sweetness and joy. And I do, okay, and I'm gonna finish this real quick. And also reparations and like things like that. Like, I think these are all kind of slight pivots into like, in order to make a lot of this work, we really are gonna have to get all up in the, you know, feelings and guts of, you know, what has happened in this country, because all of it is related. So yeah, all of that, that's it.
I hate to rush you, Janata, because I can.
No, it's good. I just feel like I just feel like I'm like this is so passionate to all of us. Obviously, it's hard to know.
Rosemary, you have like literally one sentence and 30 seconds.
I mean, I just keep trying to figure out what I'm feeling drawn to right now, because sometimes, you know, I can get caught up in the like, what's the perfect way to do this? But I'm feeling more and more that you just pick something and then you do it as well as you can. And some of the things that I feel drawn to right now is just working from like the position that I am in and embracing that, and trying to organize coworkers and trying to recognize the ways that I function as police in my role as a mental health provider, and just like being able to really sit with some of those things. So yeah.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn now to Kathy, who's going to read some Q&As from the audience.
Yeah, so I've got some Q&As, I've got some over email too, and thank you all, that was just stupendous. And Charmaine, great job on the timekeeping. Okay, I'm gonna read the first question. Charmaine spoke eloquently about the state abdicating its obligations in favor of letting activist movements provide resources. There's an interesting dissertation from Disaster Studies that argues that social movements have been progressively integrated into that process of resource provision. It moves from the BPP's survival programs to the response to the deadly 1995 heat wave in Chicago to Occupy Sandy. How do social movements that are committed to mutual aid to positive acts avoid becoming, in effect, state volunteers? How do you distinguish between a dual power project and compensatory service provision that enables austerity? I'm just going to open it up, whoever wants to jump in. And that includes you, Charmaine.
Trust Joshua to ask that question.
Yeah.
I love that question.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. I had to read it a second time to really like wrap my brain around it.
I was done somewhere.
Yeah. And I mean, I think Rosemary, you might have a lot more to speak about it. So maybe I could let you start.
I mean, I don't think I'm smart enough to answer that question, but I can give some examples and like kind of like a perspective of one thing. So thinking long-term and strategically right now about the direction that housing justice organizing is going in Minneapolis, and seeing the different ways that we're trying to have these interventions, from the takeover of the former Sheridan to the largest homeless encampment in the history of Minneapolis and Powderhorn, which was cleared this week with arrests. Many of the people that were displaced were sent to other camps where they were just given notice of another clearing. So this is the housing policy of whack-a-mole that's just not working. I don't want to play into the whack-a-mole. And I also want to be careful about normalizing encampments. 40 years ago, when we saw a large spike in homelessness, and there's a crisis and this sense of urgency, we're feeling the urgency right now, so we have more space to work with. 40 years ago, when we saw a large increase of homelessness, an interfaith group of grassroots organizers in town got together and found ways to address the emergency, which they thought was going to be temporary, by opening up their houses of worship to be spaces of refuge for people who are experiencing homelessness. And today we call that our emergency shelter system. And I don't want to be moving in a direction where we have like a semi-state managed, like even shittier system. And I don't want to move in a direction where we aren't recognizing the kind of skill and labor that is important. I want to have a different horizon than that. And that's where like the imagination is super important, so that we can be thinking together towards something that can be like a shared bigger goal. Yeah, so as in terms of austerity, yeah, I don't want to be, I want to be supporting the workers at shelters who start at $12 an hour and are trying to unionize in town. You know, I want to be incorporating that into this discussion too. As a just sort of the example that I always use with this too, like I want to be able to go to the library and have a lot of options, and I want to be able to have a robust interlibrary loan system, and I want Elsevier to go to hell. I am not interested in only having little free libraries, you know? So like being able to make a distinction between like, what are we really asking for? Like it, you know, like, is that good enough? Is that really what we want to settle for? So.
You know, I don't have an answer for this. I don't know if this is answerable, you know, prior to it actually happening, right? But I think one way to think about it is maybe not abandoning the state as a site of struggle. You know, the question mentions the Black Panther Party as being an example of state volunteers, right? But later on, in one of the later phases of the Panthers organization, they actually do try to take over the mayor's office, right? Bobby Seale runs for mayor. Elaine Brown runs for city council, right? And that wasn't all that they were doing. That was part of the struggle. So I think the site the state could remain a site of struggle, or you organize and you organize local power, right? Kind of collective power, and then you force the state to do what you know, what you need or want. And again, I couldn't give you right now a blueprint of what that looks like, but sort of schematically, that's what I think of.
Anybody else? Nope. Okay. I'm going to ask a question that came in over email. Has there been much interaction / interplay between federal and more local authorities in Minneapolis? I have in mind, obviously, the incredible events in Portland.
Other folks can jump in here too, but my knowledge is the like explicit, we had the National Guard here for quite a few days. And the accounts I've heard is actually the National Guard members were horrified at what the Minneapolis Police Department was doing, and were prepared to use force against police officers, some of them, because the police were being so violent. yeah, so that's what I know about our federal interaction, is that they were horrified by our local police who, maybe folks know this, there's also the state opened a human rights investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department during the uprising because of the extent of the violence against protesters.
Oh.
I maybe would like to add to that, because I think that that is true. That's officially what the FBI were brought in to do. But we also historically know that the FBI turns what is a pretext of looking into police brutality into efforts to actually weed out protesters and really crack down on mass movements and manage the legitimation crisis that the state is facing right now. So as somebody who did jail support, one of the things that we started to see, even in just interacting with people on the street, was that the FBI had started to trawl through people's Facebook posts, attempting to bring in Black youth who had posted something as simple as pigs in a blanket. The ATF is on the ground in Minneapolis in droves, and part of their mission has been to find all of the people who they have now charged for aiding and abetting arson. We have up to 64 felonies. And so there's been an immense crackdown. Some of the methods of surveillance have actually been quite horrifying. You know, the ATF, for example, as just one example, traced a shirt that they saw in a video to an Etsy seller who then revealed their purchase history. And that then led to the apprehension of one of the people who's now been charged with burning down the 3rd precinct. So I think, you know, one of the things to just think about is the ways that federal agents have been mobilized in mass, you know, mass quantities to try to do this kind of crackdown. I'm also going to take this moment to link you to the Minnesota Uprising Facebook page, which is an arrestee support site and is going to start a Drop the Charges campaign soon. So I hope you follow it and help to support them, especially because the people who, you know, the Black youth who burned down the precinct are now paying the price of potentially 20 to 30 years in jail for starting a mass uprising around the world.
Thank you for posting that. Junauda, did you want to add something? Oh, you're on mute. There.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, restate the question again.
So it's about federal police presence.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just going to say something a little bit of what I heard, but it was kind of hearsay. But yeah, like I think, well, and it wasn't necessarily as much around federal presence specifically, but just around white supremacy within our local Minneapolis Police Department and ways that like other, you know, like, like other factions coming in to amplify and, you know, be in networks with each other. But I kind of feel like I don't know necessarily the full details, but yeah, that's all.
Can I add one thing into that discussion too? I think that there's like a very real and pressing risk of non-state actors joining with state actors in this. So there's white supremacists within law enforcement agencies, and there's also white supremacists who are not on the payroll, but who can blend in really well right now. When the tools that they have are rented minivans and camo, you know. So this is going to be something that's going to be a real threat to safety, especially at mass protests, that I think we need to be able to grapple with. It's like a really perverse version of, you know, like individual community members showing up to do like, you know, rather than housing people, showing up to become the police department. Yeah, I think that we got to be careful about that.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question. And I am going to ask this one. One issue that we run into in our municipality is how to balance, on the one hand, calling counselors in and providing resources for them as we move into the weeds of defunding, with, on the other hand, using more antagonistic tactics. What did this look like in Minneapolis? Did Black Visions Collective reclaim the block and MPD 150 spend a lot of energy rebuilding relationships and rapport with counselors, or was that less important than outside tactics?
Wow, what a good question. Thank you for that. I think it was both, right? We were definitely in conversation with them pretty much constantly as we were trying to figure out what to do, at the same time as putting on public pressure to get the most and biggest win possible. You know, politicians are always going to be politicians, right? So the thing here is that we had a lot of power in Minneapolis, and we had a lot of years and years of education and smaller fights, whether it was like our Invest Divest campaign, or like, you know, just a few weeks or maybe the same week as the Sanctuary Hotel. Like, we were planning, right, to get some water to an encampment, and like people were organized around that. And we, so, and you know, things got a lot bigger than water. But so I think, yes, we worked with politicians, but I think putting all of your energy into befriending politicians is never going to be the best payoff, right? Political education among the people is the best payoff. And also, I will say we have a team of like deep nerds, myself included, who read the budget like in full detail and basically draft what we would like to see the budget look like and present that. And so for cities who are newer in defund campaigns, like getting really familiar with your budget and all of the loopholes and sneaky ways that politicians will try to move money and that you can move money really can open up a lot to make things possible.
Anybody else? No? Okay, well, there's actually one more question that we'd like to ask. It's the last one. The panelists discussed efforts by local folk to provide security for communities. Also, we know that U of M and the MPS have canceled their contracts with MPD. Has there been commentary on their plans for plans for security and how they plan to use the funds they are rescinding from MPD?
I can speak a little bit about the schools, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the schools are trying to be a little sneaky and put out a job application for essentially private security. You have to have a criminal justice degree to have this new position to replace the SROs, school resource officers. And the primary job description is to improve relationships with law enforcement is the role of this person. And they get paid almost twice as much as a teacher starts at. So, but the thing is, our educators here, our local teacher unions caught on and were able to successfully stop the process. They had a rally of 100 people on Sunday, which was the last day of the job application being open, stop the process, and now they're gonna work with the district and try to make sure that the folks who actually are like the security officers in the school who have relationships with kids, who are more the de-escalating force and not the police, are eligible to apply for these jobs in these schools that they've been working in for decades.
And I'll just say at the University of Minnesota, yeah, they have broke ties with the MPD, but there's still the university police that are on campus, right? So they, you know, there's been, as far as I know, thus far, no, you know, no talk of separating from police altogether. And as far as what they're doing with the funds, you know, with the budget shortfall that's coming because of COVID, I don't think they're not saving money, and they're not gonna, and even if they were, I don't think they would be using it for, you know, towards an abolitionist kind of ethic as far as police go. So that's my partially informed understanding of what's going on right now.
The university also has contracted with G4S to provide private security, just to throw that one out there. So, yeah.
Charmaine, did you want to add something?
No, I'm good. I mean, I maybe just want to quickly say that part of what is so beautiful about listening to you is the reminder that abolition is really a constant struggle, right? When this stuff was happening, I think it got blasted on social media as massive victories. I think some people fight for their entire lives to get the police out of MPS and get police out of, universities. And those are massive victories. And yet we see time and time again, this kind of re-invitation of different forms of repression or different forms of co-optation. And part of what is really inspiring about what I'm seeing with all the work you're doing on the ground in Minneapolis is that you refuse to take each of those as victories, and you're continuing to fight to push that abolitionist horizon further and further forward.
That's a great note.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, that's all. I just wanted to
No, I was going to say that's a great note to end on, but I don't quite have enough time for another question, but wanted to give you all a chance to kind of maybe make a final statement, or maybe something that hasn't been talked about that you wanted to share, or just another reflection like Charmaine's.
Yeah, I feel like this is just a moment to continue to believe and center imagination and like building around abolition in every single facet. Like, I think this moment has helped me really understand how deeply policing is into the marrow of all that we navigate often. So yeah, just keep imagining and letting that seep into your spirit.
Any other final comments?
Well, just want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk. It's an honor to be on here with all of you. And I really admire all of you and the work that you're doing. So please continue.
Same.
It's been fantastic having you all, really a gift. And thanks for all the websites and links. I guess there's probably a way that I can share this with viewers if they want it, but if people didn't get a chance to write it down, I think I will have a copy of it. So people can always email me. I'll put my email in here.
I have a quote to read to finish this off. I was inspired while we were talking. It's from Molly Ivins, and she said, "So keep fighting for freedom and justice, beloveds, but don't forget to have fun doing it. Be outrageous, ridicule the fraidy cats, rejoice in all the oddities that freedom can produce. And when you get through kicking ass and celebrating the sheer joy of a good fight, be sure to tell those who come after how much fun it was."
Wonderful. That's a great way to end. Thank you, everybody. This has been terrific.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for the incredible work you're doing. Just want to shout out the incredible thousands of organizers who are continuing to do the work on the ground every day in Minneapolis. Thank you so much for your fight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charmaine. Thank you, Catherine, and everybody. So great to meet all of you.
And again, this will be available on the DHI website, www.dhi, oops, I'm totally blanking. ucdavis.edu in a couple days if you want to share with your friends and colleagues.
Thank
you. Have a great evening. Wonderful to meet you all.